So far in this environment, Bitcoin's kind of held up surprisingly well, and gold's been a little bit surprisingly weak given the geopolitical things happening. The outside variables that could really change Bitcoin being at, say, 50,000 or 200,000. Mm-hmm. And so I would expect that in the next cycle, the next, say, 2-3 years, I would very much expect to reach new all-time highs. The range of outcomes, like 6 figures, would not surprise me at all. I think what really kind of contributes to Bitcoin's next bull run is not something like this necessarily. It's one of a couple things. It could be the spot ETF approval. If we get one of those, that's a new demand source. But the metric that Bitcoin is historically most correlated with is global liquidity.
In a recent interview with Kitco News, Aldan, founder of Aldan Investment Strategy, began by sharing a bullish long-term outlook for Bitcoin. The global financial landscape remains shrouded in geopolitical uncertainty as risk appetite wavers amidst escalating tensions. The cryptocurrency world is abuzz with significant developments today. Bitcoin is currently trading above $27,600, experiencing a 1% decrease on Tuesday. In a noteworthy political move, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., a staunch advocate for cryptocurrencies, has decided to run for president as an independent, parting ways with the Democrats. During the interview, Aldan expressed that, in his opinion, a price of $27,000 for Bitcoin is attractive, especially when considering it from a long-term perspective. Aldan recently tweeted, "I like the orange coin for the next few years at current price levels, no firm opinion on in the next few months," and this was in response to a tweet by Samson Mao, who said in a single day the US added more than half of Bitcoin's entire market cap in debt. That's something like 10 million Bitcoin, and yet there are still people that are unsure if 27,000 is a good price to buy. So when you say you Bitcoin bulls say fears over contagion among crypto lenders and exchanges that fueled crypto winter in 2022 have finally subsided, and investors eagerly await the SEC's decision on the spot Bitcoin ETF, a regulatory milestone that could significantly impact market dynamics. Bitcoin has a history of unpredictability and extreme volatility, and 2023 appears to be no exception. The popular crypto is up more than 65% year to date. In the interview, Aldan predicted that Bitcoin could conservatively reach $50,000, but it has the potential to go well beyond 6 figures. Now, let's shift our focus to a few clips from the interview.
At 27,000, I think it's an attractive price when looking back several years from now.
You mean to buy it?
To buy it,
okay,
yes.
That's not your price forecast then.
No.
Okay.
No, I think this is a good accumulation zone.
Okay.
And it's basically saying that I'm bullish with a multi-year time frame. But a multi-month time frame is mostly going to be governed most likely by liquidity, or things like spot ETF approvals or denials. There's all these kind of things that just can throw curveballs and change. You know, if we do get kind of a bond yield spike and a dollar spike and a liquidity problem, Bitcoin could go down a few $1,000s again. Who knows? So I don't really trade it on a week by week or month by month basis, but I do think looking back 2 years from now or so, I do think that 27,000 is an attractive entry price. And then you just have to manage your volatility around that. So I mean, if you're an 80-year-old retiree, you have to manage that volatility that Bitcoin has compared to if you're a younger investor. And then, of course, you also have to manage how much have you looked into Bitcoin? How much have you studied Bitcoin versus are you just looking at a price chart? Because I would argue that the more you understand it, the more you kind of naturally want to have exposure to it, but maybe not for everyone.
Where do you see Bitcoin price in 2 years' time? For the number go up, people that always like to hear a price forecast.
So conservatively, I expect it to probably be double by late 2025. So, a little over 2 years from now.
So that still wouldn't hit its all-time high.
Yeah, but I think that's the conservative level.
Okay.
I think the range of outcomes, like 6 figures, would not surprise me at all. Generally, what we see is that if you look at measures of global liquidities, and we can define that as global broad money supply in dollar-denominated terms, right? So that comes down to how strong or weak the dollar is relative to other major currencies, and how quickly are their broad money supplies expanding. Bitcoin is highly correlated with that metric. So generally speaking, when money supplies are going up very quickly and or the dollar is weakening, generally Bitcoin's in one of its major bull runs. That's historically what's been the case. Whereas when the dollar is strengthening, when global liquidity is tighter, when we have quantitative tightening, when we have these kind of attempts to rein in this inflation, that's when Bitcoin has a bear market and then a big consolidation market. And so again, the next 6 months, liquidity, pretty hard to predict.
Right.
But I would very much expect that within the next 2 years, we're probably going to have another positive liquidity cycle. I would say that it's very hard for them to manage things so tightly for another 2 years. And so if we do get that another positive liquidity cycle, I would expect it to be very favorable for Bitcoin. But there's an inelastic supply. There's a potential spot ETF. There's how much liquidity are we going to get? There could be trend changes in certain countries, for example. Maybe a lot of people in India, for example, maybe Bitcoin starts catching on there. Maybe it doesn't, right? So there's these outside variables that could really change Bitcoin being at, say, 50,000 or 200,000. And so I would expect that in the next cycle, the next, say, 2-3 years, I would very much expect to reach new all-time highs. 2 years specifically, conservatively, I would say I'd be surprised if we're not significantly north of here. That's why I said 50,000 as what I would consider kind of a conservative target, but it could comfortably be in the six figures. And I think that rather than thinking with specific price levels, the way that I approach this is this network and is this asset more attractive than other things I can buy on a multi-year time frame? And my assessment for Bitcoin is that it is. It's still, on a risk-adjusted basis, one of the things I definitely want to have exposure to, not to be all in on, but to continue to have significant exposure on.
Rumors of a U.S. government shutdown impact asset prices, including Bitcoin. Bitcoin's price bullish action toward $28,000 on October 1st was partially fueled by the uncertainty regarding the United States debt limit. However, United States President Joe Biden signed the spending bill just hours before the September 30th deadline, avoiding a government shutdown. The fourth quarter's trajectory for key financial assets could mirror that of the prior 3 months, particularly if U.S. yields continue their upward trajectory. As of the first week of October, there's scant evidence that bond market dynamics will reverse, with the U.S. economy's remarkable staying power giving Fed officials the leeway to maintain a restrictive position. According to Aldan, this is where Bitcoin's distinctive qualities shine. It's a global asset without central control, and it cannot be diluted. During periods of turmoil in major markets and currencies, Bitcoin's appeal tends to increase gradually over time. Now, let's shift our focus to a few clips from the interview.
When you look at most asset prices during government shutdowns versus not government shutdowns, it's usually not like this immediate impactful thing. It's not like the government shuts down and markets go haywire, because it's more of like this behind the scenes slow motion thing that's happening. All the essential stuff still happening. The Treasury's still issuing debt. Things just, kind of the more time sensitive stuff is still happening. The military is still at their posts. Those things are still happening. And so it's more of like that slow perception. And it really kind of feeds into the idea, Bitcoin is this decentralized network. There's nobody unilaterally in control of it. It's open source, so people can build on top of it. They can shape parts of the network, but there's no kind of central authority. Whereas, right now, the biggest money in the world is the dollar, and that's essentially the Federal Reserve's ledger. So it's a centralized, nation-state ledger, partially controlled by the Fed, partially controlled by the government. And when you see the dysfunction in Washington, it does start to chip away at the perception over the long term. The more this happens, the higher magnitude this happens, it kind of contrasts. These are the people that we're relying on to manage what we use as what we earn our wages in, what we have our savings in. These are the people that are running the centralized system. One way, when we go back to the question of do government shutdowns matter, I think it's one of those things where 9 times out of 10 they're not going to matter, and historically they've not mattered. But it's one of those things you don't know ahead of time which time it actually might matter. There may be something so dysfunctional happens that maybe it does matter this time, right? That's one of those kind of unknowable questions.
Yeah.
And when you have bond yields this high, when you have equity markets still kind of in a trouble zone, I do think this is overall time where you don't want to be overextended in terms of risk overall, because we can kind of go over the statistics or the reasons why a government shutdown is generally not that impactful, but we can't necessarily predict kind of these tail outcomes of something where it suddenly could matter.
Right.
And so Bitcoin is one of the advantages of Bitcoin is that it's a global asset. It's not controlled by anyone. It's self-custodial. It can't be diluted. And so anytime you have dysfunction in some of these major markets, these major currencies, it does over time feed into the Bitcoin narrative. But I think what really kind of contributes to Bitcoin's next bull run is not something like this necessarily. It's one of a couple things. It could be the spot ETF approval. If we get one of those, that's a new demand source. But the metric that Bitcoin is historically most correlated with is global liquidity. So if you, for example, were to have the central bank intervene on these bond market situations, kind of like how they had to intervene back in March on the banking system, whenever you get that kind of liquidity intervention, that's when Bitcoin's likely to do very well. It's very responsive to that historically, and I think it probably would be again. So that's the kind of thing more I'm looking forward to what's going to propel Bitcoin's next bull run. But all these kind of narratives around the margin, I do think feed into the longer term narrative of Bitcoin.
Bitcoin is firmly established as the leading cryptocurrency as it holds nearly half of the value of the entire cryptocurrency market capitalization, and the token's growing status has firmly established it as a digital representation of gold in the eyes of many investors. Bitcoin prices maintained a fluctuating pattern above $27,000 in October, reflective of the crypto market's dynamic nature. That concludes our conversation for today. If you have any thoughts, please share them in the comments section. If you found this content informative, please consider giving it a thumbs up and subscribing for the latest updates. Thank you for being here with us.